My name's Graham, and for my sins, I'm currently the chair of Cooperative Care Colne Valley. So this is a new cooperative care organisation that we've been developing over the last 3 years or so. Our big news this week is that we've now got clients, we've got staff, and we're like doing the thing for real. This, having spent 3 years talking about doing it, we're now actually doing it, which is quite phenomenal. A little bit of housekeeping, I guess, before we get into the meat of the thing. So if you're not talking, please mute your mic so that we don't get any weird background noise and feedback. If you want to speak, make yourself known, shout, wave your hand in the air, something like that, and we'll notice you. And if you want to ask questions during the course of the session, my advice is to put your question in the chat if you're able to do that. And myself and my colleague Veronica will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll catch up with those once Cliff has finished his talk. Okay, so just a bit of introduction, I think, next, by way of how we got here. So when we set up the cooperative here, we thought, yeah, it'd be a great idea if we were like a multi-stakeholder organization, so that we could put our care workers and the people in receipt of care right at the heart of the organization. We wanted them to be front and center in the organization. But then we've also got some investor members, people in our community who have given us money to help start the service, and we want to welcome other community members into the cooperative as well, because it's really important that the cooperative is embedded in the community that it serves and owned by it and accountable to it. So these are really important features that we think are critical if we're going to be successful. But we don't really have much of a clue beyond that vague idea about how you actually make a multi-stakeholder cooperative organization work in practice. So some while back, I got in touch with Cliff and asked him the question, and he said, well, it's really complicated. So I thought, and we've had a couple of really good conversations about it. And on the last webinar session that we did, it was where we were looking at various different models of cooperative care, and we had Adrian here from Cartreffe in Wales, and we had John Roberts from the Northwest Care Cooperative talking about the way that they did things in their cooperatives. And it became really clear through that conversation that this issue about multi-stakeholding and how you make that work, it wasn't just specific to us, it was actually quite a broad issue that lots of people were interested in. So we very quickly organized this one. What I'd like to do now is just hand over to Cliff. For anyone who doesn't know him, Cliff is a preeminent cooperative lawyer, well known around the globe for his expertise. He's got lots and lots of interesting history and knowledge to share with us about how you do multi-stakeholder organizations properly. So I'm now going to hand over to Cliff. We'll do the Q&A bit afterwards. So thanks very much. Over to you, Cliff.
Thanks, Graham, and good evening or good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's great to have you all here. Thanks so much for joining. And I hope this is a useful, this next hour is useful for you. So as Graham explained, this is a session that's about organizations that have more than two or more categories of members. In the cooperative mutual movement, we're mainly focused, we're mainly familiar with single constituency consumers or workers or producers. But this session is concerned with organizations where you have more than that. So I'm going to do 3 slides by way of history. It's always good to start with some history. 3 slides by way of the challenges, and then 3 slides by way of some solutions. And I hope that what you'll take away from this are two, I think, quite profound points. I hope you will agree, but also quite one significant question that I've got very much in my mind, which I hope could be a subject for future discussion. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. The slides will be made available later online. So can you all see the slides?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, good.
If I can just get them to, right, so I'll crack on. Good. So yes, to start with some history. If you look at this poster on the right, this advertisement, the Barwell Boot and Shoe Society, based in Hinckley near Leicester, the heart of the boot shoe making East Midlands in England. And if this is an organisation, this is a cooperative of both workers and customers. It was formed in the 19th century. And if you go down towards the bottom of the poster, you'll see it says full trade union rates of wages paid. We might come back to that. And underneath that, it says profits divided between capital, labour and custom. Shares £1 each, bearing 5% interest and 10% of profits. And if you look at the rules, this is what was called a co-partnership society. Most of the cooperative societies in Victorian times were consumer or distributive societies, as they called them. There was a significant number of worker societies or productive societies, and then there was a handful, a tiny handful, there were about 8 by the end of the century, of special societies like these co-partnership ones with workers and customers. And if you look at the rules, Barwell divided its profits, its surpluses, 40% went to workers, 10% went to the share capital, as it said at the bottom of the poster, on top of the 5% interest they're already getting, so they didn't do badly. And the customers were getting 20% as well. Now, if you're either new to the cooperative movement, or you're thinking, you're kind of pondering about this, of course, it wasn't all about generating profits for distribution. If we go back to the Rochdale pioneers, the fundamental point about a cooperative was to achieve fairness and to avoid exploitation. And if you go back to the pioneers, they say very clearly that their organisation is for the improvement of the social and domestic condition of its members. And the trading they carried out, the shop or the store, and the other things they mentioned, houses for members to live in, land for members to cultivate, etc. They were all a means to an end. What this whole enterprise was about was mutual aid and support, and getting people access to food and services on a fair basis rather than the highly exploitative basis that was going on. And the dividend, the distribution of surplus, wasn't a sharing of profits. It was actually an ex post facto adjustment to the purchase price. If they'd made a surplus, they must have charged people too much, or not paid them enough in the case of workers. And so the dividend, historically, is an ability to adjust the price or the costs at the end of the period to make sure that people weren't being exploited, that they were getting a fair deal. So having clarified the purpose, if we then go back to Barwell, so how did they run their society? How was it organized? Now, Barwell, we know from the rules, they were basically model rules with a limited amount of special rules. They didn't have different constituencies of members, nor did they have board members representing workers or customers in the rules. So we can't tell from the rules how the governance worked. All we've got is the distribution rule allocating surpluses, as you just saw on the first slide. We also know that co-partnership societies weren't common, and we might deduce that actually they weren't a great success. One or two did survive into the 1970s, maybe a bit longer, but they weren't, you know, there were something like, at the turn of the century, there was something like 1,500 distributive societies, about 150 worker co-ops, but a tiny number of these. So they weren't a great success story, but they were the forerunner of what was to come. And if we now fast forward to the 21st century, we have that well-known phrase, the multi-stakeholder approach, and Cooperatives UK's multi-stakeholder model rules. And here they most definitely do recognise different categories of members. They recognise users, employees, and producers, or whatever categories you want to insert into the rules. And in addition to that, they build into the board structure user members and employee members and others as appropriate as you adapt the rules to your circumstances. So in fact, what they're doing is making sure you don't have a dominance of one particular constituency on the board. And that approach of having representatives on the board isn't unique to cooperatives. In this country, for example, social housing, we have tenants and local councillors and independents on the board. There are plenty of other organisations around the public sector where board seats are reserved for particular interests or constituencies, sometimes for particular organisations. So the Cooperatives UK rules are not untypical, but actually they pose something of a challenge, because the very idea of having representatives on a board doesn't fit very well. Those of you who've done board training, which I imagine is probably most, if not all of you, will have been told by some wordy lawyer that the first thing you've got to remember when you sit on a board or a committee is that you owe your duties to the organisation as a whole. You might be there representing particular group of members or interests, but actually you've got to leave your hat outside the room because you're there to the duties to the organisation as a whole. And the very idea of representativeness doesn't actually fit very well within that. We're living with it, we get by with it, but it is actually a tension. And there are plenty of situations I've known, particularly in social housing, where tenants are invited to join the board and they get there only to find that actually they can't do what they thought they were going to do because of the underlying law. And of course, once you start having more than one constituency on the board, it's getting harder, because you've got those constituencies really wanting to be heard in conversation. But actually, again, that doesn't fit very well with the underlying legal model. And of course, it's also dependent on the individuals who happen to be sitting in those seats at the time as to how forceful they are, how articulate they are, how passionate they are. And it's so the very idea of representativeness on a board has its challenges. And we can't really separate that question from another quite fundamental legal and practical point, which is to do with skills. It's common that executives running a business have the most knowledge of that business, but they don't serve on the board, and constitutionally they don't owe duties from their post. Whereas those who are elected members on the board, they may or they may not have the skills needed, but they owe the duties under the Constitution and the general law nevertheless. So you've got these challenges, which are not just legal challenges, they're practical challenges about the way we're tending to do governance in I think quite a lot of organisations. And this isn't I'm not saying anything particularly novel or dramatic. I contributed a paper to this ICA document in 2015. Mine was chapter 8, and there's the reference which Veronica will put in the chat if you want to pick it up. And I argued in that document, which was a year or two after the travails at Cooperative Group had dominated the headlines in this country, at least. I highlighted the tension that exists between having representatives on a board and having to have people with the right skills and competence. And I argued in that document that the Rochdale approach, that's to say the elected board in charge of running a society who appoint a manager who does the day-to-day management, that actually that approach, which works fine on a small scale, or can work fine on a small scale, starts to struggle legally and practically when the business gets very big or complex. And you might say that was very much what happened in the case of Co-op Group. And so I put forward the argument that actually we need to be exploring other options, and particularly in the situation where we've got more than one constituency of member. If we've got users and workers, for example, we've got a more complex situation simply from that. And so I've started arguing that we need to separate out these two functions, the representative and the executive functions. And what I'm going to talk about isn't the answer, it's just a different approach for you to think about. And if you just start on the left-hand side before we get into the details, we've got members, and we've got a members council, members body, and a board. So you'll see that instead of the members directly electing a board, the members elect a council who appoint or elect a board. And this is a different approach. It's actually the sort of direction of travel that Co-op Group have gone in. But the approach I'm talking about goes rather further than they've done. And in other examples that I'll come on to in a minute, we've used it for organizations that have a number of constituencies, typically users and workers, but potentially others. They could be carers, they could be volunteers, they could be family members, they could be local residents. It depends on the sector you're in and the business you're in. But these different constituencies elect their own representatives onto a body, a members' council, representative body, whatever it might be called, which has the specific job of being their representatives. And that body does not run the business. There's a separate board of directors who run the business. And that board of directors comprises, as I believe it should do, a couple of senior executives who know the most about the business, and a majority of non-executives who are appointed and can be removed by the members' council, so that in practice, the members' council remains in control of the board, because it can remove the majority of non-executive directors. And this approach is designed to do a number of things. One of them is to give the members a much bigger role in shaping the future strategy of their organization. And that in this model, we specifically give the power to the members' council to take part in developing the strategy and approving it. And this approach is specifically designed, A, to accommodate different constituencies of members, but B, to separate out the representative function from the executive or management function. And the advantage of doing this is that it fully empowers the representativeness, which can otherwise be constrained within a board where you're focused on running the business. You locate it in a different place in the organization where the entire role of that body, the members' council or whatever it's called, is to act as the representative group for the wider membership, and to do specific things which those members need to take part in, namely shaping the future. What are the services we're going to provide next year? What different things are we going to do? And it then focuses the attention on the board having the right skills and competencies, because you're not trying to get particular constituencies or representatives on the board. But on the other hand, because certain things are taken away from the board, it is less powerful. It's a management board. It's not in charge of the society's future strategy, because that remains with the members. So it's a less powerful board. This idea comes from the NHS Foundation Trust movement. That's where I came across it in 2003. I helped set up quite a lot of them. And we then took this approach into social housing, into Cooperative Cymru, social care organisation, and into a number of other organisations, where we've got this structure where you've got members, a members' council, and a board. And if we just step back from the details of this for a minute, what's going on here, the fundamental rationale behind this is that every business involves a tension between different interests. If you take the typical company, if your shareholders are going to make the maximum profit, then you're going to want to cut the costs, the wage bill. You'll want to minimize what you pay to suppliers. You'll want to maximize what you get from customers. And so every business actually has this tension between the different constituencies of interest. And your typical company manages that by having contracts with customers or workers, and they have no voice in the entity itself. It's only shareholders who do. In a cooperative, what we're trying to do is to get behind that unfairness and give the relevant constituencies a voice. And what this approach does is to do exactly that, to provide a voice to workers or users, and to bring the tension that exists with those. The business still wants to keep its costs down and to optimize its income, but it brings that conversation within the organization instead of externalizing it into third-party contracts. And the governance provides a mechanism to hold and resolve that tension openly and fairly. And that's what I think's going on here. And my big question, in the last year or two, I've been getting more familiar with sociocracy. And I've wondered whether, instead of having different categories of membership, whether sociocracy could be a mechanism for decision-making and holding and resolving that tension. For those of you who aren't familiar, sociocracy is an approach to decision-making. It's a very flat approach, non-hierarchical, which works on a basis of consent at each stage, making decisions on a good enough for now basis, but enabling continual review and development of the organization. It's probably worth having a separate session on it on another occasion for those who are interested, but potentially it's such a different way of making decisions. I wonder whether it could be an alternative approach to having different constituencies of members. But I still think you would need to use that in the members' council. So my final slide, every business has tension, balances tension, but uniquely a cooperative can mediate that tension within its governance. But if it's going to do that, the ownership and governance arrangements need to be designed to do that. You can't just put a couple of people on the board and hope that that's a job done, in my view. Governance can also be designed to make it more likely that boards will have the right skills and competencies, and that you really do empower and provide a robust mechanism for member democratic control. But for me, the other big, really profound point is, of course, the Victorians were concerned with capital, labour and custom. And as we now know to our cost, they were not so astute about the planet and set in motion the burning of fossil fuel, which is now such a big challenge for us today. And to me, the big challenge going forward for us is we need to be working out how to take account of the needs of the planet as we design ownership and governance arrangements alongside capital, labour and custom. I'm not suggesting I've got the solution on the back of an envelope here. We might talk about that later if that's a subject of interest. But that's a huge amount for you all to have taken in what's probably about 20 minutes. It's not quite 8 o'clock. We've got till 8 o'clock, if you're in England. But I hope that is a useful kickoff for this discussion. At which note, Graham, back to you.
That's brilliant, Cliff. Thanks very much for that. That's yeah, you've covered a lot of ground there very efficiently, I think. I just wondered, before we get into more of an open discussion, if I can just sort of hold the space for a minute and ask you whether you could talk about any sort of specific practical examples that you've been involved with where you've seen that this approach work well. Can you give us a sort of a practical case?
Yep. I think the example, the inevitable example I would give would be Rochdale Borough-wide housing, which has been going for 10 years. 2011, it did a stock transfer and adopted this approach, and over the next couple of years, it evolved. And what in that organisation is called the representative body gradually became empowered and took on its role, took on its functions, and started to represent the interests of the employees and of tenants, and now plays a very important part in the development of future strategy and the monitoring of the board and the executives in particular. I think there are actually one or two people from Rochdale Borough-wide housing on the call this evening, so we might even bring them into the conversation. But I think one of the most profound learnings for me in setting up RBH was right at the earliest stage. There's always the assumption that when you've got groups of representatives, they will fight for their own interests. If we're a worker, we'll look after the workers, and if we're a user, we'll look after the users. Mm. And one of the most profound learnings I had right at the beginning working with Rochdale Borough-wide was, I won't go into the details of it, but how at one point the tenants became extremely angry about how the employees were being treated by an external third party. It wasn't the employees were unhappy about it as well, but it came out, it was the employees who wanted to sort things out it was the tenants who wanted to sort things out for the employees. And actually what started to happen was to see a collaboration between those who want to earn a decent wage and those who don't want to pay any more rent. You know, there is a tension between them, but they recognize that they have something really important in common, which is a well-functioning organization that they both depend on. And for me, that was a profound step forwards. And I think that it's seeing that kind of thing in action, which really demonstrates the value of going down that route.
And that the structure that's in place at RBH, how did that lend itself to that that sort of realization? Did that come about as a sort of a top-down thing, or just emerged from the conversation that was going on?
No, not at all. The particular issue I'm referring to was a negotiation with the banks. Social housing is all based on money lent by banks to fund social housing, and the banks were wanting some conditions that were found to be in the constitution that the members didn't like. Mm. So the executives were running the negotiation with the banks. Here amongst this group of democratically elected people, the issue was resolved because the employees, the tenants were very angry and said, we're not having this. And the employees said, well, actually, we need to do this because the bank's got the money. If we want to go ahead, we need to reach an agreement. And so the employees, you know, the move came from then. I mean, I'm sure it was more complex in that in taking it through the system, but effectively it came from the bottom up. This is what we need to do. We've got to swallow this because we just want this transaction to happen. We'll resolve it in 2 or 3 years' time down the track.
Fascinating. That's great. Okay, let's move on to some questions. We've got a couple here. So from Gillian, is interested in the role of unions in a multi-stakeholder setting. And she says, kudos services in South Australia, they're trying to get the members' voice to be bargaining on behalf of members. So just before you answer that, I just want to do a plug, because we're going to have a webinar later in the spring, which is going to be wholly focused on the role of the unions in this context. So bear that in mind for a later date. But Cliff, have you got something to say about the role of unions?
Yes, this was an issue that cropped up a lot with NHS Foundation Trusts, actually, Graham, where at first the unions said, well, we represent the workforce, we want a seat on this members' council, to which the answer was, well, no, the employees themselves can go onto this members' council. Please encourage the members of your union to join as members of the Foundation Trust and to put themselves forward for election. But those representatives on this body are the mechanism for us engaging through the constitutional route. The unions still remain important because they're still there in their role representing their members in a conversation, in a dialogue with those whom they negotiate with. So that relationship remains in place, but it's a separate one from the constitutional relationship within the organisation.
Yeah, so they're not represented directly within the governance arrangements, but they have their conventional, traditional role
Yes.
in terms of bargaining with management, as it were, I suppose. Yeah.
And there's no doubt, we have to accept it is a tricky. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, of course, the cooperative movement emerged as the voice of customers, and the trade union movement emerged as the voice of workers. And as we saw on that poster at the beginning, full union rates paid. You know, they were there alongside the cooperative movement. But of course, the union movement, there hasn't been such a big tradition of worker cooperatives in this country. The unions have tended to continue to be the voice of the workforce. And so there is a sense that, and this happened, I think, within the Foundation Trusts, that the unions, there's a sense in which they feel rather threatened by this facility of giving their members the chance to participate directly in the organisation. Does it undercut the role of the unions? Well, it clearly has an impact, and we've got to be sensitive to that. But actually, it's perfectly legitimate for them to continue to have a role in the function where they've always operated. Yeah,
it's interesting. We've got a question from Neil, who says, hi Cliff, are there examples of where it hasn't worked out so well? That's an interesting one.
I suppose the answer to that, Neil, is the organisation. This has only started in the last 10 years, and there are a number of organisations that are on the journey. They're all on a learning curve, and they would say some things have gone well, some things haven't gone so well. As you can imagine, it's not just, I mean, the lawyer can write the words on the page and do the legal structure, but actually to make this stuff work, you're changing the culture of an organisation, and indeed you're changing the culture of a sector. And that takes years or decades, not weeks and months. And so I think you could talk to organisations that have gone down this route, and they'll tell you things that they've found difficult and how they found that have been really helpful. I did a session with 3 of these organisations the back end of last year, and one of the shared problems they've found is that the members' council tends to be treated like another board of directors, and they tend to, the process, meetings and papers and reports and minutes, and actually they're people who don't really want to fit into that slot. That's not what they come to. And the phrase we used in those sessions was, they want to bring their lived experience as tenants or workers into the room. That's what they want to contribute to the discussion. How you do that is a constant iterative and learning process, and I'm learning that as much as they are. But none of the ones we've worked with so far have unravelled the arrangements that have been put in, Neil, if that answers your question. But I'm sure they would tell you that they've got bruises along the way.
Yeah, I'm sure of it. Okay, that's good, thanks. And we've got a question here from Melina. Basically saying, have we got experience, or have you had any experience or thoughts about using this member council approach in sectors other than care, social housing, which is what we've talked about so far?
The answer, Melina, is yes. I mean, I think you dropped off the call when I was saying that this actually comes from NHS Foundation Trusts, where the structure comes from. They're not a great example in a kind of cooperative sense, because the role of members in a foundation trust is very limited. Whereas if in the examples where we've introduced this, the tenants and employees or the others are very engaged, and there is a real very meaningful basis for membership. And what you're talking about, what you're doing in Australia with putting more independence on the board, that's a common approach over here. The one organisation that I've worked, one organisation in social care I've worked with is Cooperative Cymru, who Adrian Roper did a session last month on this webinar series, and they provide accommodation, and no, not accommodation, they provide care for people with learning disabilities. They're not actually a landlord, across the whole of Wales. And they adopted this approach a couple of years ago, and they're not as far down the journey as Rochdale and Merthyr Valley's homes. And of course, for them, with members who are users of their services, who often have or may have capacity issues, the ability to participate is obviously very varied, and therefore you're also using family and friends and other carers to as part of the mix of this membership of these different categories of members. So it's enormously challenging in that context, but they are on that journey, and they are exploring different options around different places in Wales. And yes, another, I've kind of introduced the same idea in a worker co-op in environmental services recently, a smaller organisation with about 40 members. I think really this is an approach which is either for a larger organisation economically or with a larger workforce, because the governance is obviously more heavy duty, and you don't want it to become disproportionate to the business of the organisation. Mm-hmm. But I think there are ways of doing it in a more light way.
Yeah.
So yes, there's a bit in other sectors, but not a lot yet.
Okay, that's really interesting. I've got another question for you here. So one of my concerns has always been about what Neil Hampson calls cooperative degeneration, which is a term I really like, or sort of management capture, where the members, the sort of rank and file members of the cooperative, become increasingly less and less engaged, sometimes facilitated by management, to the point where by sort of de facto you've got a sort of chief exec that runs the whole thing, and you lose all of that richness. And is there a risk that by putting your members into a members council, which is therefore by default sort of a step removed from the nuts and bolts of running the organisation, is there a risk that actually facilitating that process, or do you think it can help to counter it?
The point you raise about management capture is hugely significant in any organisation. And I think there are 2 points to make in response. I think what keeps members engaged is having their representatives doing meaningful stuff. If their representatives sit on a board and are involved in decision making that they don't hear anything about, and they're not consulted on or rarely have contact with their representatives, then it wouldn't be surprising if membership interest dwindled. If the members' representatives are fully engaged on a regular basis with the process within the organisation, and they are a group of people who are dedicated to communicating with the membership what's going on, to my mind, it creates the opportunity for a much more powerful conversation and relationship between members and their elected representatives, and keeping them engaged. I think the other point is the question of influence that the members' representatives have within the organisation. And I think that where you've got a couple of or you've got elected representatives on a board, well, it depends whether you're talking about one of the retail co-ops working with an executive team or the multi-stakeholder board. But it can be more difficult to see the real value that the elected representatives are bringing to the party, because the perception is the business is being run by the people who are paid quite a lot of money to run the business, and that's what we want to do. And so the role of the board tends to focus down on some fairly specific things that it does, which may or may not be of great interest to members. So I think that, to my mind, these different arrangements ought to provide a more powerful platform for maintaining member engagement and member participation. But at the end of the day, it's how you run it. And there are you get organizations who might use this who pay lip service, or you might get organizations that have got a few people on the board who are fantastically responsive to their members. It's very hard to generalize when you're designing governance. But to me, what I want to make sure is that the arrangements themselves are self-evidently designed to provide a voice to the members, and actually provide an opportunity for the members' representatives to make real decisions about issues that affect the members. And you can write that into governance, you can write that into rules by saying the members' council have to approve next year's strategy. That's a very powerful thing to write into a constitution.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.